Bases2016 welcomes Igor Witkowski for 2 presentations, and we are really privileged to have Igor here in the United Kingdom. Igor Witkowski is author of numerous books and a military journalist and a former editor-in-chief of 2 military magazines. He is best known for his participation in many TV documentaries on the Nazi efforts to master anti-gravity, although in fact he has written over 60 books, most of them deal with different topics. He is an expert in the field of German secret technologies as well as in the development of human civilization in general. Much of his research has been dedicated to the role of extraterrestrials, both in our history as well as in the incoming changes on Earth. Witkowski lives and works in Poland. The fact is, we lost his second lecture, so we are going to invite Igor back for a major presentation at some future date. This doesn't make us happy, it makes me very sad, but we do have his first presentation, and this is it. Right. Igor, this is a tremendous honor to have you here.
My
I
pleasure.
really look for, I'm a big fan of yours.
My pleasure.
And it was great to see you in Poland, although we've had some tragic events happen there, but that's nothing to do with what we're doing now. So, I welcome your first presentation. Your second will be one tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Let me introduce myself first. I'm a researcher from Poland, an author of over 60 books on various subjects, but I started as a military journalist, and initially I was involved with research on various armament projects, history of science and technology, Third Reich of the Third Reich in particular. But after some time, I found an interesting thing that the past is quite often a key to the future. And tomorrow, for example, I will be speaking about certain German research project, which is a door to master a gravity propulsion system, a UFO propulsion system, if you like. But it will be tomorrow. But it's just an example of my area of research. But I was also writing books about how to say that, about the role of alien civilizations in the development of our civilization, of humanity, and I was writing books about various evidences from the past that prove that such interventions took place indeed. But my most important book, which is completely unknown in the West, although some were translated into other languages, is about, it's titled Instructions of Awakening, the Strategy of the Transformation on Earth and the New Renaissance. It is something that differs significantly from what has been published in the West on this subject, because it's based on very many sources. On the one hand, these are the sources from extraterrestrial sources on us generally, on how the alien civilizations perceive us and what kind of strategy they have towards Earth. But it is confronted with analysis of what is going on around us, and such a comparison gives a very interesting insight into what is already going on in the world, and where it is heading. And as I mentioned, the point of view of them is such that it differs from what people usually think about it. Okay, I will, shortly speaking, the repeating thread in such an alien announcements is that humanity will have to transform significantly. I mean, quite dramatically. And they give reasons for that, and the entire strategy can be proven in such a way that it may be proven that it is inevitable and necessary, and the origin of such ideas and objectives, I mean aims of it, are quite logically explained in my book. It hasn't been published in English, but it has been translated, and I have printed a couple of copies here for you in case anybody would be interested in what I will be speaking about. Okay, so one thing about us in their announcements that is dominating and repeats itself in the announcements of various extraterrestrial civilizations, is that our perception of reality is significantly flawed. I do realize that it doesn't sound very too clear, but I will try to clear this out during my presentation. One thing that they emphasize is that humanity is heading towards a disaster because it cannot perceive or see the threats that it itself is creating. One of the most important things is that, according to them, is that humanity or just people cannot see even the basic information around them. Because they have certain cliches or matrices or cultural patterns that act as perceptional filters, and I could give numerous examples of that. And shortly speaking, it makes that humanity has created self-destruction mechanisms, which have to be stopped, or interrupted, or altered, and whatever. One of the things is that one of the examples of humanity not being able to see the most basic things is, for example, a thing that I have described in my book. In this book and in other books. How does it happen that you don't see it on the screen? That's a problem. Okay. No, there's something wrong. I would like to ask Miles if he is somewhere out there to fix the problem. One of the things is one of the examples showing that humanity cannot see even the most simple fundamental things is that, for example, there are dozens. In one of my books I presented about 30 of paintings of religious paintings. I cannot move from one picture to another because it's not on the screen.
Brilliant, we've done it.
We will return to the previous ones, but okay. One of the examples is are the religious paintings of Christianity from the Middle Ages or Renaissance, which originated in various countries from the Middle Ages until the 16th or 18th century, in fact, in various parts of Europe or the Christian world generally, And this is, for example, a presentation of a painting from former Soviet Georgia, not to be confused with the U.S. Georgia, the oldest church in the Christian world, in Georgia, excuse me, the oldest church in Georgia, which shows us that in the background there are, I don't have this mouse, okay, I thought that I could be able to show details with this way, but it's not possible. Okay, it shows two disc-like objects in the background. It's just an example. On the, if you take a closer look at the one on the right, you would see that there is even something that resembles a window. Yeah. Oh, great! Thank you. Okay. Great. It's okay. Yeah, this one here. There's kind of a window, so on. And I would not discuss details, but what I would like to show generally, something is wrong with the colors. There is another one, which is you can find it on the internet, by the way. It is from a church in Florence, which and it shows the Roman emperor and the oracle Sibyl pointing to a giant disc-shaped object above Rome, over Rome. That is Rome. Well. Again, I can do nothing about it.
I'm just bringing the level down. Hopefully that will show what you want to see.
Yeah, it's better. Okay, thank you. This is another example. This is from 1710, from a Dutch painter, who had access to the secret part of the Vatican archives. It is titled "The Baptism of Christ," and you can see the Christ here and some kind of flying object above, which illuminates Christ with such beams of light. This is an interesting example because it shows that our civilization may have access to the information, but still it cannot make any use of it as long as it goes beyond the cultural patterns that are reproduced over and over again, and it almost looks like people were programmed to be able to see some things but not the others. So according to the aliens, as long as people will not be able to look into their culture, their patterns of programming in a way, they will not be able to make any progress. And this is just an example of how limited the perception of reality in our civilization is, according to the aliens. And I will get back to the other interesting evidence on the subject, but it's worth remarking that we can see various other examples from our own backyard, showing us that our civilization is unable almost to cope with, to perceive the major fundamental challenges, to even existential ones. And one of such an examples is the fact that, for example, when the so-called financial crisis, I will later on say that it's not in fact a financial crisis, but it's something deeper, has started in 2008. There were, for example, 19 European Union summits on this crisis, but on not even one of them, as far as I know, there were we could see any attempt to address the issue of the problem, the origin of the crisis, the fundamental, the fundamental origin. No, I don't know how to say it, but the grassroots, as the Americans would say, of the crisis. What really has caused such a problem, which obviously lasts until today. It's not what we have today. The situation that we have today is not an emergence of some other crisis. It's still the same one, because it hasn't been addressed, and its sources were not seen by our civilization, and therefore nothing could be done about it. There is no in such circumstances, in such a situation, there is no it is impossible to make any improvement if people are not able to see the origin. Therefore, they cannot create any solutions. That's another example, and I will let myself at this moment to quote a couple of statements from alien beings on this problem of how they see our civilization. For example, one of them has said, I have quoted all the sources in my book, obviously, but has said, "You do not want to change and develop. You're afraid of changes. You associate change with destruction. You do not understand developmental processes. You hang on tightly to what is outdated. You change for a while and then go back to your previous state for eternity. You abide in an eternal slump." That's one example. Another one. You are called upon to think for yourself, to believe in yourself, and to consciously create a peaceful and sustainable version of reality by accepting complete responsibility for your life. These 25 years of accelerated energy involve a huge transformation of consciousness that will collectively clear perceptual limitations and expand your perspective, essentially freeing humanity from a state of bondage that is as yet largely unrecognized. Another example, the last one. You are blinded by your beliefs, which shut you down. Which shuts you down. You are in a state of denial, and as a humankind, you have been programmed to exist in this mind-controlled state. The more you believe in only a linear world, anything and everything outside your timeline will be blanked out. You dismiss them, filing them away in the never land of unfounded notions, and think that is not what I was taught up. Or that is not what I was taught, or what I was told. Such an examples. And what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that drawn by the extraterrestrials that have since the beginning of humanity intervened or manipulated our development, assisting it mostly, but not always it was the case, by the way. The conclusion is such that in order to make any significant changes in this respect possible, it will be necessary to cause a kind of cultural shock, which would destroy our culture completely, which is not as difficult as people usually think, by the way, because, for example, I am from Poland, and I had one very interesting experience in this respect, which demonstrated me how easy it is to destroy our culture. It was in we had such a series of UFO manifestations near the town of Wylatowo in central Poland. Over several years continuously, mostly during the summers, but generally more or less continuously over a couple of years, from 2000 until 2003, or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but it was very interesting to see not the UFO manifestations, and I mean crop circles or various encounters, various kinds of encounters with generally over a long period of time, continuously, with affecting in one or other way basically all the inhabitants of a small town, such as the size of Pusey, for example. And what was visible there, what was the most important thing for me, that I treated like a kind of a revelation, is were not the crop circles itself or other such things, but what was going on with these people over this period of time. And it was visible that their culture, the way of seeing things, everything, has collapsed completely. It's unbelievable. It would be hard for me to describe in a couple of words, but it showed me that how it is easy to, how unstable our culture, how volatile or fragile our culture is. And we can see examples of consequences of such limitations around us, only that, which is proving the main thesis of what I'm talking about, it is only proving that humanity cannot see the things that are around it, even if they are close, if only they do not match the people's preconceptions. One of such an example, another such an example, there are countless. Some of you probably are aware of the limitations that our science has developed, that it cannot see even the most fundamental things. Another example from this field is, for example, their attitude towards the UFO. I would tell you about my experiences from Poland, because I was a military journalist. I knew in the late 80s and the 1990s several people from our military which were involved in the research on UFOs, of various kinds of investigations, but it also involved a group from our general staff of the army, which probably means an intelligence group, but I'm not sure about it. Nevertheless, there was a bunch of evidence on the subject that was irrefutable, not just single documents in forms of single sheets of papers, but entire books about specific cases. And for a long, I'm not sure how it is at the present time, but for a long time it wasn't even secret. And as you can guess, whenever I was talking with a scientist about it, their responses were always the same, and you can guess of what kind. Once I was invited to a radio show, and on UFO, and because I knew the presenter, the host, I proposed to invite a general a colonel, excuse me, from the command of the Air Force, who gathered investigation reports on the UFO cases in the army, in the military, and on the other hand, an astronomer, because the guy from the radio wanted to have somebody, as a scientist, as a skeptic, and in spite of the fact that this colonel was presenting, as I mentioned, irrefutable cases. For example, when a UFO was seen by a crew in the air, on a screen of a radar, and by personnel on the ground, the scientist was, it was more or less like my impression was like a devil in a bath of holy water, because he just couldn't admit anything. He just couldn't afford it, and that's how our science works. And it's another example that these limitations that I mentioned earlier are omnipresent in our world, and the science is no exception. It is working on a principle similar to the Middle Ages, where there was a kind of an ideological key that imposed on the perception of the reality. What, for example, the Americans, or perhaps people in the UK as well, call political correctness is neither political nor correctness. It's just, there is a much simpler word for it. It's ideology. It's an ideological key to the filter to the perception of reality, affecting science as well. But what the aliens or extraterrestrials have worked out is is a strategy of a complete collapse of the fundamentals of human civilizations in terms of the mental fundamentals, such as culture and educational systems and so on. And their strategy is based on an assumption that we are creating a crisis, a major crisis, which is already beginning, and it will not only cause a kind of financial meltdown or collapse or economic collapse, which is this you may find in the mainstream media, but this strategy mentions some other things as well. And one of such things is that it will lead to mass riots in the Western countries. But by the way, if the West economically or financially will collapse, because the problem is such that because nobody is addressing the sources of the problems of the stagnation or the stasis or the crisis, there will be the main approach of our political elites to the economic or financial problems is printing money, not removing the sources of this problem, because it's beyond this system. It cannot see it, and because the money is printed in all the major economies, such as in the UK as well, but mostly in the United States, in Japan, and in the European Union. But luckily, you're not part of the Eurozone. It is mostly causing various kinds of bubbles, speculation bubbles, and because of that, any destabilization of the system will lead to something like a crisis of the money, which wasn't seen by our civilization yet, never, and it will be a complete collapse of the fundamentals of the economy. But what they mention in the strategy is that it will lead to mass riots and social decomposition, a social decay as a result of this. And as a further result, it will lead to a complete, I would say, mental bankruptcy of the existing elites, especially political elites. The trust in politicians, in political parties, will disappear completely, and their strategy is aimed at forcing people to see alternatives to the way of you know, of development, if assuming that humanity can see what development is at all, which is not really the case. But one of quite interesting, and sorry about, I just forgot about this pictures. This is for example a graph showing U.S. federal debt. This is the state in 2006 or 8. I can see it. This is the present situation in 2016. So it shows that it's a straight path to disaster. Just an example. I could quote many such examples, and that the collapse therefore is inevitable. In other words, this debt can never be repaid. There is no chance for it. And another indication of that something is looming in this respect is there is a graph showing the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index. This is the situation, which is the accumulated value of the stocks on Wall Street, on the American stocks exchange. This is the situation in 2008, which is perceived as the beginning of the economic crisis then, but it shows that today the bubble is much larger than it was in 2008, and therefore we may expect something much worse collapse. This is the situation of the but I may omit it. Let me. No, I can move from here because there are microphones. On the other hand, I'm not able to read what is out there. But what I remember is that it's just a small remark, but it's not also the case that the problems that I was talking about are limited to the Western world, because this is a situation in a globalized world of kind of connected vessels. I don't know how to say it in English, but these economies are closely tied with each other. In other words, and for example, China is to the same extent addicted to the export to the West as the West is addicted to the cheap production in China itself. Any collapse will cause problems in other parts of the world without any doubt. All the more that we see continuous escape of capital from China, and there is very gloomy statistics of social unrest in China, only that it is not shown on the Western media. But over the course, for example, of I guess that from 2006 until 2010 or 2011, the Chinese official governmental Bureau of Statistics has noted 180,000 mass protests of various kind, for example, in China. So in a situation where there are entire cities built on the industry exported to China from the West, in a way, then you may see it's a potential social bomb, one of many. And in the Middle East and in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, you can also see a major turmoil. It's not just about Libya or Syria or Iraq, but there is a very unstable situation in Egypt, for example, as well. Saudi Arabia is often mentioned as a country which has also a social bomb of some kind, because when the prices of oil are falling, they cannot subsidize the social state that they have created. For example, these are just examples, and this limitation of perception I could talk about them infinitely, because this is a photograph from Spain, and by this way, I may remind you that what can be expected in the near future, which is the question of months, perhaps a year or two, is something much worse that will undermine the social structure, and therefore a kind of political structure of the Western countries. This is graffiti made by a guy called Banksy, on which I called globalization, which shows the sickness of our world, shortly speaking. That's another one that I, for myself, titled the development of civilization in the West, which is in illustration of the fact that the production rises. There are many sophisticated things, material things, but mentally people are, I would say, regressing. That the case with the internet, where the access to information has become easier than before, illustrates the fact that it is not the access to information itself that is the most limiting our future, determining our future, but the mental patterns inside of our minds that makes that we can see some things, but we cannot see another ones. That's a culture illustration for a cultural problem, referring to mostly to the United States, because it is the first industrialized country where the life expectancy is shortening because of such problems of cultural limitations, shortly speaking. We did have this, but another thing quite interesting, I wrote a book about it, are the various traces or evidence from our past, remote past, which shows that the development of humanity didn't progress as the science is imagining, but what is more important is that is another thing. This is my photograph from a ruins called Pumapunku in Bolivia, where there are stone blocks cut in such a way that maybe I would try to focus. No, cut in such a way that there are convex, profiles inside of these stone blocks, which are cut with a precision around 1/10 of a millimeter, even in these corners. And the problem is that there is no tool presently, even the lasers, which could do it with comparable precision. And one of the interesting, curious, revealing experiences that I had is was an attempt to discuss this with an archaeologist who has worked out there in Bolivia, with these blogs, and I asked him just a question how he would do this. Obviously, at the beginning of the conversation, he emphasized his opinion that there is nothing unusual or extraterrestrial, denying and so on. But when I asked him how he would do this, just this. There's not much visible on this picture here, but for example, there is a profile here, and there is another one, but there is a third level, so to speak, in the middle here, which is not visible actually. But that was another example for me how the science cannot see the major fundamental challenge to its perception of reality, because it's a proof from the past, it's an evidence from the past, which shows clearly that there was some kind of a technological civilization very many years ago. There is no direct datings of this ruins. But it is estimated that it is from about 5th or 6th century after Christ. I don't know how it is in English, but it is not certain. Anyway, it is very much. It is really old. As I mentioned, it's not the most curious thing for me was that science was unable to perceive it. Such an interesting thing, even if it had, or a scientist had it just in front of his eyes. What do we have? Okay, I will go back to that. I'm short of time, but one of the things that I'm interested in, and I have described in this book that I mentioned. This is the Polish edition. As I mentioned, it hasn't been published in English. I just have a few copies. One of the interesting things that of the interesting information that the extraterrestrials convey in this respect is a strategy of going out of the stasis, civilizational stasis. It is their strategy of an education based on a completely different assumption, and the purpose of the school would be completely different. And frankly saying, this is the area that I'm concentrated on from now on, because one of the, as I didn't tell you very much. I didn't even tell you 10% of what I wanted to say, but there are various kinds, because they see as inevitable the collapse of our civilization, but most importantly of our culture. There are various kinds of culture shocks prepared, and because they see as they consider the most significant blockage in a way of our psyche, the religious systems which implement dogmas instead of aware thinking. I don't know how to name it in English, but because they see generally the existing religions as something that blocks our perception in the most profound way. Therefore, one of the kinds of shocks that are prepared are religious shocks. Religious shocks, excuse me, and it is supposed to start from the next year on, from the spring of the next year. I'm not sure if it's true, but it seems credible to me what I have heard. Because it would be the main kind of a trigger for the major changes that will take place, that people will start questioning what they are being taught. Obviously, I have to add here that the systems of programming people in a cultural way by the media, by the educational systems, are not just a coincidence. They perceive it as a system of controlling people, because it's not the concrete walls that are the most unpenetrable for people, but the mental blockages, because people themselves on their own generally will not be able to overcome them, and therefore that's what has caused that they decided to concentrate as a kind of it's not these changes are not just about destruction. They have that would be a typically human way of perceiving changes. They also have a strategy of development, and as I mentioned, the most important constituent of this strategy is the change in the way people are educated. I have described it quite extensively in my book, which is something that you cannot find anywhere practically, because the main problem is that for example, the main cause of the stagnation of the Western world is that this world is just not competitive. That's why people are losing jobs, and most of the people are getting poorer. In fact, for example, in the United States, because according to the official statistics, it's generally 1% of the top 1% of the society that is getting richer. The rest is more or less stagnant, but it's not really true, because the true inflation is hidden, is manipulated, because the United States are basing on the belief in the dollar as international exchange currency, main global currency, and they are very keen to maintain this illusion of the dollar, and therefore the inflation is manipulated. It is higher that is been thought, and therefore there is much lesser growth, if not if it is at all. And therefore one may say that top 1% is getting richer, but the rest is getting poorer. And sorry, I just forgot what I was about to say. But generally, they as I mentioned, they have not just a It's not just a strategy of destruction of what it is presently, but also a strategy of building. And the educational systems described in my book are the most important thing here. But there are other things as well, such as the technologies that would cause a dramatic leap forward in a way, such as the hidden knowledge about mastering gravity, which will cause a complete rebuilding of the of our physics, and there are other things as well. But there is no time for me to discuss them. I have to finish. I just will ask you if you have any questions. I'm deeply sorry that I couldn't discuss everything. I just touched the subject, but what I want to say is that this strategy is something that is comprehensively was very. Generally, it wasn't, discussed in the Western media, books, and so on. And one of the, by the way, if I may, just half a minute, one of the things that is shocking the extraterrestrials, I mean the mainstream. I'm fully aware that there are also beings that are not so friendly to us. But I'm speaking. I'm aware of that. I have been attacked myself, but I'm speaking about the mainstream of the alien civilizations. because generally the what is applying to this phenomenon, if I may say so, is that to the development of civilizations in space is generally the law of evolutions, quite similar to our laws of biological evolutions. And if we assume that there are various civilizations in space, and they can survive various adolescent challenges to the existence, so to speak. They can overcome self-destruction mechanisms and so on. Therefore, after some time, after millions or billions of years, the leading civilization in every galaxy usually are the ones that are very strongly concentrated or have a very strong emphasis on development, much stronger than we can imagine. For example, their entire culture is oriented on development, and therefore their cultures are not so diverse as we have here on Earth. They are in a way simpler. And earthly civilizations, although they have various limitations for them, they are also a subject of envy of some kind in this respect, because we are a diverse planet, much diverse than usually is case in the space. But generally, okay. I am fully aware that there are civilizations out there that are not so helpful for us. But it's the main laws of the basic laws of space evolution, so to speak, are causing that generally there is an emphasis on development, and quite strong one. For example, they cannot understand from their perspective, our world is something very strange. They cannot understand why, according to them, we chose such a path of stagnation instead of tuning to various information changing around us. Why we try to tune the reality to our preconceptions. It's hard to understand for them. For one of such things that is very strange for them, and when we will start wondering about it, it probably will be strange for us as well. Is that we cannot understand, for example, what the creativity is. I'm not speaking about how to create creativity, but what it is generally. You have, for example, I wrote a book about new approaches to creativity, for example. One of many, as I mentioned, I wrote over 60. I'm aware, for example, that you have a guy here in the UK which is quite famous. It has his initials are KR. Who is writing many books about causing creativity by teaching dance or music. For the aliens, it is something unbelievable, because for them and for me, creativity is an ability of seeing what the other people cannot see, not dancing. That's infantile. And that's just another example of how different their perception. I mean, the perception of the extraterrestrials of us is different from how we ourselves see our world. Okay, that's about it. I have to finish. I only may ask you if you have any questions. Yes, please.
If you say that we are stagnating. Because that we are being controlled as a world, as a population.
Yes, we are being controlled because the politicians don't need a society that would be able to actively participate in democracy. They don't need it for anything. They have their own aims. Yes, we are being controlled, and the entire social collapse and economic collapse, as a result of the economic collapse that is announced, is aimed at making people see that they were being controlled. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Igor. And could you give us a little bit of a highlight, Igor? What you will be discussing tomorrow?
Okay. I'll be talking about the so-called the bell or the Glocke. It was a German device developed during the Second World War, aimed at controlling gravity. And what is interesting here is that it can be proven now, because there are documents already, that they have really developed a completely different approach to gravity, and it also corresponds with what I was talking just today, that they're looming, scientific or technological breakthroughs as part of the transformation. But it's a very interesting story that I was researching for almost 20 years, very extensively.
Yeah, I think anybody who's seen anything about the Nazi bell and seen that picture of the so-called henge is Igor. You're the man who got that started into the West. So we got to thank Igor for that.